Hello and welcome to this, the first in a series of broadcasts to bring you news and views from Deloitte. My name is Robert Bruce and I'm a financial journalist, and with me tonight to discuss the latest exposure draft on leases are Veronica Poole, Deloitte's global IFRS leader, and Mark Beddy, a senior partner in Deloitte's real estate group. Veronica, I've lost count of the number of times I've heard David Tweedy, the past chairman of the International Accounting Standards Board, give his joke about how he hopes before he dies that he'll fly on an aircraft which is actually on the airline's balance sheet. And we heard Hans Hugevorst, his successor as chairman of the IASB, last autumn, talking about the hidden leverage behind leasing. I mean, this controversy has been going on for decades, for years. What's the real problem about it?
Well, what at the heart of this debate is whether all leases should be recorded on the balance sheet. Mm-hmm. And this very much depends on how you view the economics of leasing. The IASB argue that leasing is a form of leverage, and therefore that they all should go on balance sheet. Others argue that what we today describe as operating leases are in substance service contracts. The numbers involved are huge, and so people care.
And to illustrate the numbers, I think we have taken the top 50 companies in the FTSE and estimated that they have disclosed lease obligations of over £100 billion. And if you take my sector, real estate, the value of real estate has been estimated in this country, of commercial real estate, at about 700 billion. And so you can see that some of that is leased, quite a lot of it is leased, and therefore the lease obligations in respect of that will run into many, many billions.
And so presumably, Veronica, this can't be dealt with purely here. It has to be dealt with across the pond as well.
Oh, well, yes, indeed. And the IASB and FASB are very much aware of this, and they have been working on this project together. It is one of their convergence projects.
So what are they proposing?
Well, the proposals are quite complex, and the original idea was really about bringing leases on balance sheet and getting rid of that bright line that we currently have, which is the bright line between operating leases and finance leases. So for lessees, under their proposals, what we would do, we would recognize a right-of-use asset and a corresponding liability for the payments that are due under the lease. This approach would achieve that objective of putting leases on balance sheet. But what, of course, we would then have to ask ourselves is, what do you get in the profit and loss account? In the profit and loss account, under the right-of-use model, the P&L expense ends up being front-loaded. Well, this arises because what happens to the right-of-use asset over the life, well, gets amortized on a straight-line basis. What happens to the liability? Well, that gets amortized using the effective interest rate method. So the net effect is the front-loading, and many argue that this just does not represent the economics of an operating lease. So in order to deal with this, the IASB had brought in a different bright line, a new bright line, and that one is based on the consumption principle. Under their new consumption principle, what you recognize in the profit and loss account is driven by whether the lease involves a significant consumption of the benefits of the asset that is subject to that lease. So for most property leases, it is argued that a significant portion of the asset is not consumed. The accounting impact is that the lease is grossed up on the balance sheet, but in the profit and loss account, you get one straight line number for lease expense. For other leases, which is in effect all equipment leases, the leases are on balance sheet, but you get a front loading of the expense. The way you get to the straight line expense for property leases is simple. The number for the amortization of the asset is effectively a balancing number. So whilst the interest on the liability is dropping off, the amortization of the asset is increasing, producing that net straight line effect. This is very much similar to what we currently get under operating lease accounting. Now, there is no conceptual underpinning here. This is just a pragmatic accommodation that gets us to a desired outcome.
How has this fix gone down, Mark?
Well, I think from the profit and loss account point of view, that it will be welcomed, because many occupiers are very concerned about the impact on their metrics of having front-end loaded leasing. But I still think the occupiers will be very unhappy at the fact that there is now a new bright line being entered into,
Yeah.
which is going to require them to go through a pretty monumental exercise of going through all of their property leases, of which they may have many hundreds or even thousands. And I think the other challenge they will have is that often the quality of a lease database is not of accounting quality, and which has a higher burden of quality, and therefore they will have to scrub their databases quite significantly. And I think the third area that they will be unhappy about is the degree of subjectivity which will be entered into the number, because they will have to make judgments on such things as how long is the lease going to last, are they going to exercise a break option, is the landlord going to negotiate an early release. There are all sorts of commercial issues which they will find very hard to predict, but nevertheless will have to make an accounting judgment based on it. So I think views will at best be mixed.
What about the impact for lessors?
Well, so here again, for property leases, lessors will keep the underlying asset on balance sheet and account for the rentals as they fall due, which is what we currently do under operating lease accounting. But for most equipment leases, the underlying asset will be replaced by two things: a receivable for future rentals and the residual asset, which would reflect the present value of the asset recoverable when the lease ends. And this is a big change in accounting for what we currently classify as operating leases.
Are they going to be happy about that?
I think the property investment community will probably be less happy than they were. Under the original exposure draft of a few years ago, they had a complete exemption from any of these proposals and therefore could continue to account for their assets without any change. Now, the proposals are framed in a way to ensure that in most cases property leases will remain unchanged from the investor's point of view, but the introduction of new bright lines is going to be unwelcome in that the property investors will similarly have to do a monumental exercise of going through all of their leases to check that they all fit in. And whilst it's true to say that the proposals are framed such that they won't have to change, they'll still have to do the exercise, and there may be issues at the margins around, let's say, assets that are getting to the end of their useful life. You could actually say that by the time they come back to the investor, they're not going to be worth anything, and therefore they actually end up falling into the finance lease box. So yes, again, mixed views, I suspect.
So Veronica, overall, has the IASB made progress in this effort?
Well, we can definitely say that some good thinking has been done around what is a lease. And there have been some significant simplifications around what is contingent rentals, how you determine the lease term. But we do have a new bright line and a new set of challenging judgments. And I guess the key question for all of us as we set out to consider these proposals will be whether as a whole this new model is an improvement to what we have today.
Well, the leasing debate is obviously going to go on for some considerable time. And Sir David's plans about the aircraft are still up in the air, as it were. But that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much indeed, Veronica Poole and Mark Beddy. Thank you very much, and goodbye.